I'm gonna start by creating my stocking shape. I'm trying to draw, let me use a B pencil so that you can see this a little bit darker, but I would recommend using an HB, not a B. You wanna make sure that you're leaving enough space over here for the little items that are going to be peeping out from above. As you're starting to create these larger shapes, I just want you to focus on proportions and making sure that you're utilizing a good amount of your space. You don't want your stocking to be too large or too small. And you also want to make sure that you're leaving enough space for the items that are going to be coming out from above. And also, we're going to be adding a little message, Merry Christmas, or whatever you'd like to add at the bottom. So make sure that you're leaving enough space for those. It's hard to talk and draw or paint at the same time. It's something that I've had to learn to do, and it didn't come naturally to me, and I'm still working on. So I'm continuing to refine my shape of my stocking. So this is what my stocking looks like. I tried not to erase too much. And you can see how I left enough space over here at the top so that enough, my little items that are going to be peeping out from the stocking over here on top have enough space. And I also have enough space down here to add my message. And I try to keep my stocking centered. And then over here, I have the little back part of the stocking. And then I want to do a separate front part of the stocking over here. And then I want the stocking to have stripes. So I'm going to do a few stripes here, but I don't want to make them super narrow because the more narrow I make my stripes, the harder they are going to be to paint. So don't make them super, super narrow. And we're actually going to be adding dimension into those stripes. So I wouldn't recommend making them super narrow. I have, let me count them and I'll let you know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You don't have to do the same amount, but try not to make them super narrow so that you can actually paint them and create dimension in those stripes. Now I'm going to create a little string or ribbon, whatever you'd like to add over here, but this is the thing that the stocking would be hung from when you actually hang it up, okay? And then I'm going to add little elements in here, like it's full of Christmas treats and goodies and stuff like that. So I'm going to do a little kind of gift box here, just starting with a blocky shape and going like that. I'm going to move on to adding one of the other items here, a little candy cane. I'm going to add the stripes into the candy cane now. I'm going to try to make them a little bit curved because candy canes are more like cylindrical structures, so a little bit of a curve is important. And these stripes, yes, they are a lot smaller than these stripes over here, but these stripes are more important to paint and write than the stripes in the candy cane, I would say. This is the focal point, right? This, the stocking itself. The last thing that I'm going to be adding in is just a couple of lines or maybe 3 lines. These are going to be, I don't know what these are called, I guess pine tree leaves. So I'm going to do 3 curved lines, all right, kind of going like that. And then the idea with this is that when I am painting, you don't actually have to draw these secondary lines, but I would say that it is important that you draw these. But when you're painting, you're going to be doing the secondary shorter lines coming out of that main stem, if that makes sense. So you're going to be doing these. You can add another one if you'd like, if you feel like there's an empty space over here so that your stocking can look a little bit more full. But that's essentially it. So we have 3 little items, if you will. We have more leaves, but you can consider all the leaves as one item. So by adding 3 different items, we have a nice variety in the stocking. For my red, I'm going to be using this red right here, which is cadmium red light. This is a warm red. I definitely want a warmer red for Christmas stuff, not a cool red. So any warm red that you have is going to be great. Let me bring it close to the camera so that you can see it. This is a warm red. So in order to paint white areas with watercolor, we need grays because we need to create some gray values throughout those white areas to create a sense of dimension or even texture. We cannot leave areas completely flat white because that is going to lead to flatness in a piece and it's not going to look very realistic. And so you have to think about, well, how am I going to be developing my gray values in whatever white area it is that you're going to be painting? You could go with just a ready-made gray, such as a Payne's gray, or even a neutral tint, something like that. This is Payne's gray. Payne's gray is a blue biased gray. And you can actually see this on screen, how it looks bluish. Payne's gray is a cool gray. Usually it's ivory black plus ultramarine blue or a blue. Okay, mixed together, and that creates the Payne's gray. When you use something like neutral tint or ivory black or something like that, Mars black, those blacks tend to be very flat and very neutral. And sometimes that can lead to a dull looking piece if you just use ready-made blacks as they are. If you are going to be using a ready-made black, what I like doing is mixing in a tiny bit of blue into it, alter its temperature and make it look a little bit more vibrant. I never use ready-made blacks on their own. Not anymore, since I discovered that it really affects the look of the watercolor piece. And so if I were using a ready-made black or gray, I would be using something like a Payne's gray, which is already blue biased and it has more vibrancy because it has that temperature to it. Another thing that I like doing is mixing together blue and brown to create a gray. You can mix together ultramarine blue and sepia, ultramarine blue and burnt umber, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Whatever brown you have, if you mix blue and brown together, that is going to give you gray, especially if you mix like a 50-50 amount of each. So for example, this right here is ultramarine blue. So I'm going to add a little bit of this ultramarine blue onto my palette. And then I can mix in some burnt sienna into it. This is burnt sienna right here. Burnt sienna is a reddish brown. And I'm going to make sure to add the same amount of brown into this puddle as the blue, a little bit more ultramarine. Shift the ratio until you get something that looks gray on your palette. And then you can use that gray. So for example, here it's starting to look gray, maybe a little bit more blue. See how it looks gray? If the mixture has a little bit more blue than brown in it, it's going to look like more of a cool gray or even a dark blue. And if it has more brown than blue in it, it's going to look like a dark brown or a warmer gray. And it also depends on the brown that you're using because, for example, burnt sienna is a reddish brown. It's a very warm brown. So if I add in or if I create this mixture with burnt sienna, it's going to lead to slightly different results, maybe even warmer results than if I bring in a sepia or even a burnt umber, which isn't as red. The brown is not as red. So what's cool about the blue and brown color mixture to create your grays is that it's very versatile. You can shift and alter the temperature of your gray mixture by adding a little bit more brown or adding a little bit more blue, depending on what you're looking for. Okay. See that slight difference in these two grays? They're both beautiful and vibrant, but this one is a little bit warmer than this one. It's starting to seep into this bottom one, but this section right here looks cooler than this. This looks a little bit browner, if you will. Okay, that's what I'm gonna be doing. For the candy cane, same thing. We're gonna be repeating the red that we have already chosen for the stocking stripes, and we're gonna be repeating the gray that we have already planned on using for the white section in the stocking. But what about the gift? This is new Gamboge. It's a beautiful warm yellow, which would work great for golden areas that you want to paint. I would add a little bit of yellow ochre or raw sienna into the Gamboge to get it a little bit more kind of muted or neutralized. so that it looks a little bit more like gold and not like a yellow. So that's a beautiful color that we can use for Christmas pieces for sure. I think that the present will look very nice with a color like this, and maybe the bow we can paint with another color. We can repeat a color that we've already used. All we're missing is the green and the blue. The green that I'm going to be using is Undersea green from Daniel Smith, and this is a warm green. Okay, this is a beautiful, warm looking green that is already quite natural looking. If you don't have this undersea green, you could use something like sap green, hooker's green, olive green. Olive green is going to look very natural as well in and of itself. I really like undersea green from Daniel Smith because it's deep, it's warm. And then finally for the blue background, we could do something like a cooler blue. So this is Prussian. Or we could do a warmer blue, like just ultramarine. Let me know which blue you prefer. Do you prefer a cooler blue or a warmer blue? Cooler blue, excellent. Okay, so we got that decided. I'm going to be using Prussian blue. This is what Prussian blue looks like. You could use something like a phthalo blue, green shade. If you need to change your water, you can go ahead and change it. We're gonna do this in 2 layers, and we're gonna be painting this relatively quickly. We want a loose, fresh result, okay? So I don't want you to spend too long in any single area. Don't be super finicky and try to get rid of every single little texture, because if you continue being too fussy and finicky with the little things that happen, you're gonna end up with an overworked piece. I'm gonna start with the stripes. I am going to be working with a size 4 round brush, and I'm just going to take my cadmium red light, and you can see how I'm adding water into this little edge of my puddle on my mixing palette so that I go in initially with a tea consistency of my red. I want to go in with a pretty light version, a watered down version of my cadmium red light. Okay, I don't want to go in super thick initially. I know that this entire section is going to be white, so I want my first stripe to be red. And I'm going to go in and paint this nice and quick. You can see how pale the color looks, and I just removed that paint from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm going in with water in my brush to soften that color even more, okay? And run my paintbrush bristles over the entire shape so that it stays wet for a little bit longer. See how pale that color is? I'm doing that intentionally because I want to make sure that I'm developing lighter colors or values first, and then I'm building toward the darker colors. So now I'm taking more of this red, but more from the center of the puddle, not from the edge anymore, which is very watered down. And I'm going to drop it into certain shadow areas that I want to darken while the first layer is still wet. All right. And that's it. We're going to be redoing that same process in all of the red stripes. I was able to develop lighter areas and darker areas in this first layer. And do you see how the effects are very soft? The effects are soft because I dropped in the more saturated or thicker color or version of my red, which is less watered down, over my lighter red layer when it was still wet. When you drop in watercolor on paper that is wet, you're going to get soft diffused effects along those edges, soft transitions, soft gradients. If you're looking for those soft effects, it's essential that you work wet on wet. You drop in that color while the thing underneath is still wet. Okay, so let's do that again. I removed all of that color from my paintbrush bristles. I'm going in with a clean brush into my watered down version of my red right here on the edge of this puddle. And I'm going in and quickly painting in that first layer in this next stripe. So I jumped over one stripe because I do want to make sure that I have a red stripe, a white stripe, a red stripe, white, alternating. Painting that first layer nice and quick. If you go in and you notice that you're painting in a very dark red too quickly, immediately remove that paint from your paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water. You can even tap the tip of your brush onto your absorbent towel and run your paintbrush bristles over that area a couple of times, which is going to soften that color. And at the same time, it's going to give you more time before that shape starts to dry. If your shape starts to dry, you're not going to be able to drop in your darker red and get those soft diffused effects, okay, which is what we want, especially in this first layer. So take your time with that palest color in the beginning when you're painting in that initial layer. And then while it's still wet, you can drop in more of your red in a thicker state now. But don't cover up all of your previous layer because you want those lighter values. If you cover up all of the lighter values, you're getting rid of your lighter values, and that is going to lead to flatness. Because what makes something look realistic is having a nice range of values from lighter areas to midtones to darkest darks. I was able to arrive at a nice soft look, and I have at least a couple of different red values already going on, right? Lighter areas, darker areas. And I am setting myself up for success because since layer 1, I already have at least 2 red values to build on. And watercolor is going to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So if you want to push for realism, then most likely than not, you're going to have to work in layers, which is what we're going to be doing, okay? But we have to allow things to dry and not be fussy, not start finicking over little things, because if you do, you're going to flatten everything out. Okay, so next, I remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, going in with my watered down version of my cadmium red, and I'm going in to paint this last one. Okay, painting in my first layer nice and quick. You can see how it's pale, red, very watered down. Run your paintbrush bristles over everything a few times so that it can stay wet for a little bit longer. If you're going too dark too fast, swivel your paintbrush in your water, remove that excess water from your paintbrush bristles, and smooth that out. That will soften that color and leave it wet for a little bit longer, okay? And now you take a slightly thicker version of your color, the red, whatever red it is that you're using, and you drop it into certain little sections that you want to darken while that initial red is still wet, making sure that you're leaving little sections where the first layer is left uncovered by the next dropping in of color that you do. So I remove that red from my paintbrush bristles, and here's what we're going to do with the white, because whites can be tricky to paint when we're painting with watercolor especially. What is going to make something look white is you bringing in enough of that white paper to help you make that thing look white. When we're working with this medium, we don't need white paint at all, like we do with acrylics and gouache and oils. With those painting mediums, we do need white. But when working with watercolor, we don't even need white because we're using the bright white paper as part of the piece, and we're planning for our lights or white areas since the beginning. The way that we bring in that white paper and make things look white is by using very watered down color so that that white paper can really shine through and represent those light local values, but also just leaving sections unpainted completely so that the white paper is just left unpainted. So we already decided how we're going to be creating the gray values. For me, it's going to be that brown and blue color mixture, right? I'm mixing together burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And I'm just giving it a mix here on my palette because if you saw, well, this is the same mixture. See how it looks? That happens because ultramarine blue is very granulating. When colors are granulating, what happens is that as they dry, colors separate. That is exactly what happened here in this blue and brown color mixture. You need to mix it again, remix those colors together so that you get that gray that you want. But just as an FYI, when colors are granulating, that will also happen on your watercolor sheet as the color dries. It's going to start separating. But in my opinion, it leads to a beautiful effect. It creates very nice textures and stuff. This gray already looks like a light gray. Okay, it's pretty watered down already. I'm gonna add more water into this. I've mixed it up nice and what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna add some of this gray. I'm pressing down my paintbrush into this area so that I can create a little bit of texture. Okay, I'm gonna remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles and go in with a clean brush and just do some scribbling motions so that I can develop gray values and texture simultaneously by doing a little bit of, I'm just playing with my brush. That's all I'm doing. But I'm making sure that this initial layer is relatively light because again, I want this section to look white. And if I go in with color that is too dark, removing that color from my paintbrush bristles, removing that excess water, scribbling, softening, making sure that areas are left unpainted. If you go in and completely cover this area with gray, it's going to end up looking gray, not white. Okay, so just be careful. Don't overdo it. And just paint in some gray shapes. This looks too white to me, so I'm going to drop in a little bit more gray. And that is more than enough for this first layer. If I add more gray into this layer, it's going to look gray, not white. You can use the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge. Just make sure that you've completely removed all of the color from those bristles. You can dab your bristles on your absorbent towel and use the bristles of your paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge to remove excess color that you might have placed or to lighten areas. But this is already more than enough for my first layer. And you can see how I left little sections of paper unpainted. And you can also see how this gray is very watered down. It's very pale looking. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to allow it to dry. So I am going to add a little bit of green on my palette. This is, again, I want to make sure that I'm using the same green that I'm going to be using for the other whatever other elements I'm going to be painting green, I'm going to be using the same green. Why? Because repetition of color is important because of color harmony. It's very important that you bring in repetition when you are using these different elements of art. Color is an element of art that plays a huge role in making visual compositions look harmonious and cohesive. I would recommend sticking with one same green. Think of how you can limit your colors and how you can repeat your colors, and at the end, you're going to end up with something that looks way more harmonious, more cohesive, more professional. Same exact thing that we were doing with the red is what we're going to be doing with the green, okay? So this is my Undersea green from Daniel Smith. So I'm adding a little bit of water to this edge of my puddle, watering it down. And this is still my size 4 brush, by the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in this shape in the heel with pale Undersea green. So I created that first layer, and now I'm going to drop in a bit of the darker green here and there to develop a darker value in certain sections. Okay, so if it's gone too dark, you can always use the bristles of your paintbrush as an absorbent sponge. You can clean up edges as well if you need to. So you can see lighter areas, you can see darker areas. I'm going to do the opposite side now, watering down this color right here on the edge of the puddle. I'm going to drop in a little bit of a more thicker green here and there. Okay, I'm going to lift up a little bit of this green. Let's paint the white stripes. We need the white stripes. We already talked about how if you want to make something look white, you need to bring in the white paper as part of the piece. So we need to make sure that we're leaving plenty of white unpainted or plenty of that paper shining through. But just like what I mentioned when we were painting the red stripes, we want to make sure that we are developing that nice range of values as well. It's just this white area is not as texturized as the white section on top. trying to develop a slightly darker gray value here and there. And that's it. I cannot do anything else because if I continue at the end, it's going to look gray. And last white stripe. If you leave little teeny tiny sections of paper unpainted, it helps you create a sense of texture. Like what I did over here at the top, and little sections that I'm leaving unpainted over here. Helps you create like a soft texture of sorts. Now let's paint the little items on top. And I definitely need a smaller brush for that. I think I'm gonna go with this size 0 brush. And I'm gonna let's do the little candy cane. And I need to explain what we're gonna be doing with the leaves, because if we're gonna be painting a blue background, we have to paint that before painting the leaves. But yes, I'll explain about the leaves in just a bit. But for the little candy cane, it's exactly the same thing, just this is way smaller. So we need to go in with a smaller brush, less paint, and we're gonna do it much faster because these shapes are way smaller. I'm not worrying too much about developing too many different values since that first layer when something is so small. When you're painting very small shapes like this, you kind of need to allow layers to dry in between, because if I were to go in with my super thick cadmium red right now and drop it in, many times when the shape is so small, the darker paint color expands and completely covers up the lights. And I don't want that to happen. So it's better, if I want more control in these areas, to allow that to dry completely and then paint in some slightly darker red shapes wet on dry. Hope that makes sense. But let me paint in all of the red stripes in the candy cane. Very, very carefully looking to darken certain areas. But I'm gonna paint in my white stripes with my gray. And I'm really gonna be doing minimal work with the gray here. These shapes are so small that I'm only going to be painting the outer edge with my gray and the inner edge maybe, so that I can create a sense of roundness in that cylindrical structure. Painted that in, remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles and just softening the edges. Okay, so you can see how I painted some gray, but I left white paper shining through in the middle. And I think for the gift box, I can go back to my size 4. I am going to be using this color mixture that I created by mixing together Gamboge, which is a warm yellow, and yellow ochre. If you mix together any warm yellow and either yellow ochre or raw sienna, you're gonna get a beautiful kind of golden looking color for your box. So size 4 round brush for me, going in, watered down since the beginning. Even though yellow in and of itself is a very light color, I do go watered down in the beginning. And maybe I do some red for the little bow, but don't paint the bow yet or the leaves. I'll tell you why in just a bit. Okay, so I'm just painting in this entire shape right now. Running my paintbrush bristles over everything a couple of times, then dropping in my color in certain areas just to start developing a little sense of values there, light and shadow. But you're not going to be able to develop a very wide range of values with yellow, because yellow is a very light color. The darker the color you're using, the greater range of values you're going to be able to develop with it. Okay, so let me repeat that. The darker the color you're using, the wider the values, wider value range, I should say, you're going to be able to develop with just that one color. If you're using a very light color like yellow, you're only going to be able to get so dark, even when the color is at its thickest state on your palette. Whereas with something like green or even red, which is, I would say, like a medium color, like generally speaking, it's a medium color, you're going to be able to get a wider range of values from darker red to a nice range of mid-tone reds to very lightest red. Green, this green is very dark, very deep, very rich. And so you're going to be able to get a nice range of green values using just that one green. But with yellow, that is not the case. And this is why color mixing with yellow or developing a realistic look with yellows is so challenging, is because you need to know color mixing. What color can I add into the yellow to darken it and be able to develop that nice range of values that I need? All I am missing really is a little string thing or loop, the leaves and the little bow on top of the gift box. And I don't want to paint that right now, not if I'm going to be painting a blue background, because those little smaller elements or little details are very narrow shapes, or even what you would consider lines or marks, where you create that, you're going to be painting that little loop or those little leaves with a single brush stroke. And whenever you paint something with a single brush stroke or something even very narrow like this little loop thing, I would always recommend painting that at the very end. If I paint those lines right now, and then I paint the blue background, the blue can start smudging the lines that I want clean and defined. And because I want those lines and marks to be clean, to be defined looking, I need to do them at the end after the blue. Remember that watercolor can be easily reactivated. If you start painting on top of something even after it's already dried, you can start reactivating that color and smudging it and merging colors together or blending colors together. Let's paint our blue background, and then after the blue background is dry, we're going to paint in those smaller little elements, okay? So for my background, I'm going to be using the size 14 round brush. I would highly recommend switching to a medium-sized brush or even a larger brush so that you can do your vignette, okay? If you try to do your vignette with something like this, it's not going to work. You need a larger brush that holds a good amount of water and paint in its bristles. So you guys chose a cooler blue. I'm going to do Prussian blue. Prepare a nice puddle of Prussian blue right here on my palette. I think that's enough. I should probably change my water. My water is looking like this. And because I like using pre-wetting for my vignette because it makes things easier, if I do pre-wetting with this murky water, I can start getting murkiness in my clean paper, and I don't want that. So if your water is looking like this, I would highly recommend changing it before starting with your background. Size 14 round brush. I want to use a paintbrush that is large enough. So what we're going to be doing is doing pre-wetting, and I'm going to be working section by section so that it's easier. So with clean water, you're going to gently pre-wet around your stocking, just in those areas that you want to make blue. Make sure that as you're doing your pre-wetting, you're pre-wetting past the area that you want your blue to extend into. So what I mean by that is, if you just pre-wet until here, let's say, right here, when you drop in your blue, the blue is going to expand and reach that edge of your shape that you have pre-wetted. It's better to pre-wet all the way to the edge of your paper and pre-wet past or more than the area that is necessary for your blue to extend. Because what you're trying to do with a vignette background is you want the more concentrated section of color, the darker color, to be closer to your focal point element. And then you want that color to turn into the whiteness of the paper as the color moves away toward the edges of the piece. So I'm pre-wetting all the way to the candy cane. I'm pre-wetting over these leaves that I have drawn over here. And I'm pre-wetting all the way to the edge of my paper. So all of this here has been pre-wetted. All of this here, all the way to the edge of my paper. We'll be tackling the other sections later, but I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you take your time with the pre-wetting process if you want those soft effects to happen. I live in a usually very warm, very dry environment. If I don't take my time with this and even make sure to turn off any fans, any heating systems, air conditioning, whatever it is that can speed up your drying process, it can be an issue. It really can, especially when you're painting larger areas like this. See that sheen? So I'm going in with my Prussian blue, and I'm going to make sure to drop in the blue right up against the stocking here. And I'm just going to tease a little bit of that color out toward the edges, but I do not want to place any extra color any closer to the edge. You know, you don't want to continue loading up your brush and placing more color, because I want my color, as I said, to dissipate as I make my way toward the edge. Okay, so I just loaded my paintbrush once, and that is enough color. I'm going to remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water. You can even dab the tip of your bristles on your absorbent towel so that you don't create any backruns. And then soften the edge with your clean and slightly damp brush and help that gradient happen. Right? That is my favorite way to create a vignette style background, so that the transition from the color that you're using toward the white paper is soft. I'm going to place a little bit more color as long as your paint is still wet. If you want to strengthen the blue, you can do that, but make sure that if you're placing more blue, it's right up against the stocking. You don't want to place your blue in the middle of the gradient. Whenever you're going to be placing more color, make sure that you're doing it closer to the stocking. I'm going to add a little bit of blue over here, a little bit of blue over here, and over here. So let's do this. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing, pre-wetting over this string thing. Pre-wetting all the way down. We tackled the right section first. Now we're doing the left. We'll do a little bit on top over here in just a bit, and then we'll do the bottom section. Yes, it does make the white stand out, especially because we picked a darker color for the background. The blue is a darker color. Things with a light local value, like white things, are going to really contrast and pop out when placed next to or over things with a darker local value, because of that contrast, the tonal contrast. Just painting over the string thing here. And see how I'm placing the paint up against the stocking. Intensify the blue here. And with a clean, slightly damp brush, I'm going to tease and extend a bit of that pigment out toward the left. Make sure that you don't go in with too much water, because that can create backruns very easily. When you have wet paint on your paper that is just starting to settle, and you go in with too much water or paint in your brush, that is how you create backruns. Because all of that water drips down from your paintbrush bristles and pushes out the paint that is in the middle of that drying process. And that disturbs that drying paint and creates these splotches. That is what a backrun is. When the paint is still wet, you could go in and fix it relatively easily if you're careful. If certain sections of that area are already starting to dry, you could end up creating even more backruns and more splotchiness. Softening the gradient here, and I'm going to leave that alone. Cool. So I'm going to do the bottom and then the upper section, because I need the bottom section to dry if I'm going to be adding a message. Again, taking a little bit of water at a time from my container. And this is probably going to be less blue, because I don't want... So the thing is, my letters are going to be black. I'm going to be using a pen with black ink. And if I have a dark blue background, then my letters are not going to be very legible. You're not going to be able to see them contrast against the blue background. So I do want to add a little bit of blue down here, but it's not going to extend as much as the other areas. And it's going to be lighter. So have that in mind. Just a tiny bit more blue. And then we do the top. Okay, that's enough color. Remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water. Just gently softening the transition. Last part of the vignette here. Remove that blue from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water. I'm very carefully pre-wetting this section over here. Your environment that you live in has a huge effect or impact on how quickly or how slowly things start drying on you. Yes, the type of paper that you're using, its thickness, its quality is also going to have an impact. I mean, you could be using cold press paper that is 100% cotton, the same thickness, from 2 different brands, and they will act differently, okay? So there is always a learning curve. Something that you do need to realize that will affect your process just as much as the specific paper that you're using is the environment that you're working in. If you work in a warm environment, a cold environment, you know, if it's dry, if it's humid, if you have a fan on, a heating system on, air conditioning unit, whatever it is, all of these things have an impact on your process when you're working with this medium. Okay? And sometimes you may think that you're lacking skills, but it's actually the fact that those things are affecting you and you start to get frustrated because things start drying on you. Painting over the lines. See that? I'm painting over the little gift bow thing and also the little leaves. Okay, yeah, so have that in mind, especially when you're starting out a new painting and those larger washes that are harder to do because you have to paint faster before things start to dry on you. Try to set yourself up for success. Look at your environment, and if there's anything that you can do to make things easier for you to ensure that things will not start to dry too quickly, prepare in advance, okay? Especially for the large washes. All done with that vignette. It's already looking nice. I already have developed a nice range of values, but as my watercolor has dried, it has lightened a bit. And I want to go in and create my darkest dark shadows. But this layer that we're going to be doing is done relatively quickly because all we're painting is little shadow shapes in the areas that we've already painted. We're increasing the range of values toward the darkest darks. And that is what's going to add to a sense of realism. What we're going to be doing now is creating those little shadow shapes all throughout the piece. I want you to do this loosely, okay? Don't spend too long in any single area. And remember, these are smaller shadow shapes that you're creating. I should change my water again because this is super blue and I don't want to start affecting my other colors. So very quickly, I'm going to change this. Let me know if you have any questions. So going back to the same brush that I was using, let's start with the red stripes, okay? So size 4 round brush, going back to the red that I was using before, which is cadmium red light. Okay, and now I can use it in a thicker state because these are midtones, darker midtones and darkest darks that I'm creating. So I no longer have to worry about creating those lighter values. I go in, this I would say is like a milk consistency right here on my palette where the paint is relatively thick. And what I'm gonna do is just create my little shadow shapes, very irregular, abstract shadow shapes in the red stripes. Don't do an outline. Don't create an outline because there are no outlines in realism. If you go in, I just removed that red from my paintbrush bristles, going in with a clean and slightly damp brush and softening edges. If you go in and just create outlines around your shapes, that is going to flatten out the piece because in realism, there are no outlines, okay? So remember that what you're painting in right now are abstract, irregular shadow shapes. That's it. That's all I'm going to do in that red section. Can you see how I left little edges with nothing? Like sometimes in realism, edges get lost. Edges between shapes or elements merge into each other. Like there is no line or outline separating those sections. I didn't go in with red right there. I just went in with red in certain sections right now to darken certain little areas. And you can see how this section here looks very different from these two just because I darkened little sections there. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing with the other stripes. Try to think of where shadow sections would be. Once you've painted in those shapes, remove that paint from your paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, soften edges. Final stripe. And you don't need to soften out all the edges. Sometimes we go overboard with the scrubbing and the lifting, and it can really overwork things. All right, I'm gonna do the green sections now. So going back to my Undersea green, same paintbrush, and I'm gonna create little shadow shapes in the green areas now. Thicker consistency. You can see how dark that green looks, right? That's super contrasting. I'm just quickly painting in those shadow shapes, removing that paint from my paintbrush bristles, removing that excess water, and softening, especially the inner edge. You can see how I'm using a little bit of a scribbling motion. I have a video that I shared on Patreon a while ago on brushstroke drills for textures. And I think I also share washes in that video. You can find them in the Watercolor for Beginners external index page that I've created for you, where it's a compilation of videos that I think would be great for beginners to check out with exercises that are very helpful that can help you with your water and brush control. See how different those two green areas look now that I've developed those darker green values? In that video with brushstroke drills, I talk about scribbling, stippling, C-strokes, and other texture making techniques and brushstrokes that will help you gain control over your paintbrush, so that when it comes time to develop different textures in your paintings, you know how to use your brush in a way that will help you communicate those textures. Green sections are done. When it comes to the white sections, you might not have to do a second layer at all. But if you want to add a little bit more texture or realism to your white areas because maybe they look a little bit too flat to you, you could go in with a second layer in the white areas as well. But the same kind of principles still stand. Okay, you want to make sure that you're not covering up too much of that white paper. And also, I would highly recommend making sure that you're taking it gradually, one step at a time, toward darker values, especially in white areas. If you have very light values there, make sure that you're not going in too dark with your gray. Make sure that think of like a bridge tone, like a transition tone, and paint in little shadow shapes, wet on dry. I'm gonna remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, soften any edges that I want to soften. And really notice if more is actually necessary, because less is more, especially with watercolor. You can see how by me going in and creating those little shapes, that enhances the texture while simultaneously increasing that range of values. I think this is it. That's all I'm going to be doing here. And I'm going to do the same thing for the white stripes, but I don't want these to be as textured as this. So the shapes that I create over here are not going to be as scribbly. They're not going to be as scribbly as the ones that I use for this upper section where I wanted more texture. More of a linear stroke, but also still creating an abstract shape. And with abstract shape, I mean just an irregular organic shape, not like a block or a line that has the same thickness all throughout. That's all I mean with abstract shape, is that, abstract shapes have certain parts which are thinner, more narrow, other sections which are thicker, like the thickness and the shape changes, right? That's what I mean with abstract shape. And by using your paintbrush in different ways, it's easy to create those abstract shapes. Removing that paint from my paintbrush bristles and softening. Last one. Start thinking of the message that you want to add at the bottom. Are you just going to do Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, something else? Now I'm going to be adding just a very quick darker red value in my candy cane sections. The white stripes in the candy cane maybe don't even need any extra work. I think I'm going to do the red stripes, and if I feel that that is enough, that's all I'm going to do in the candy cane. So going back to my size 0 round brush, because these are very small shapes, and I'm mostly just going to be darkening the edges of the red stripes to convey a little bit of roundness in the cylindrical object. How are you doing? We're almost done. See how I at least created a couple of red values in the teeny tiny shapes in my candy cane to convey a little bit of that 3D-ness. Before, I was mentioning how yellow can be tricky because it's a very light color. So if I just go in with more of my yellow that I was using and use it in that same way to create my shadow shapes in my gift box, you're not even going to see them. I'm going to be using my yellow ochre, whatever color you were adding into your yellow, whether it was yellow ochre or raw sienna, or even like a light brown that you have, whatever it is that you are using, go with that color. And then, which for me, it was yellow ochre. I am going to add a teeny tiny bit of brown into that color. Some raw umber would be a good one to darken this even more. The point here is that you need to add a darker color into your yellow to push it a little bit more. Because if you use that color by itself, you're not going to see it. It's not going to be dark enough for you to communicate those shadow shapes. I added a little bit of raw umber into it to darken it a little. Don't add so much brown that it becomes super dark and contrasting against that yellow. Because if you make it super dark, if you add in too much brown into it, it's going to turn too dark and those shadow shapes are going to be super contrasting and stark looking. Think of that bridge tone, the bridge transition, right? Take it a step gradually into the darker darks. When it comes to this, I can sense, or it would make sense that a shadow shape would be there right under the lid, maybe over here. Removing that color from my paintbrush bristles, removing that excess water, softening edges, taking a little bit more. There we go. We're all done. Almost done with the gift. Just develop some shadow shapes with a slightly darker color. That made sense for the gift. The last things that are missing are the little loopy-doop here, over here in the back, and the other leaves and things that will be painted with just one single brushstroke. So let's start with the loop thing, which is a very narrow shape. I'm gonna use the size 4 round brush. It comes to a nice fine tip, so I think I'll be fine. We can do it either green or red. Okay, I'm gonna go with green because it's gonna cover up the blue very well because it's so dark. Undersea green, repeating my undersea green. I'm just painting this. And this is such a secondary element here, supportive element, I should say, that it's not really necessary to go in with 2 layers. But if you want to develop at least a couple of green values or whatever color it is that you're using, you can paint in that initial layer with a more watered down green and then drop in a bit of a thicker green here and there so that you can at least have a couple of green values and things don't look super stark and flat. And then finally, let's do the other little elements, which for the leaves and the little bow, I'm gonna be using my size 0 round brush. Practice doing single brush strokes on a separate watercolor sheet with whatever paint color or paint mixture you've prepared. If you're not using a correct paintbrush for this and your paint mixture doesn't have enough water and paint in it, your brushstroke can be broken. You're gonna have difficulty creating a smooth single brushstroke. So I would recommend testing out your both your brushes and your color mixtures. Make sure that this I would say is like a 50% water, 50% paint. So something like a coffee consistency here. I want to go in with a single brush stroke. So I can still see my pencil work here. I'm gonna do the single line, like the central stem for that leaf. And once you have that central stem, you take a little bit more color and you do the smaller leaves coming out of that central stem. And these are just very short flicking motions that I am doing. So if you're having trouble doing that, I would highly recommend practicing on a separate sheet of paper. These kinds of brush strokes that we're doing at the end, you can't really fix them very easily. The tapered effect where you're starting close to the stem and you're flicking your wrist as you make your way out, so that the outer point of that smaller leaf is smaller, more narrow, as it makes its way out away from the central part of the leaf. Okay, so I'm gonna do the other one, same thing. Starting with the central one, and I do need to skip over the candy cane for this one. And what's hard as well with these strokes is that many times if one of your strokes or marks is broken or you don't like how it looks, when you go in and try to fix it, it ends up looking worse. Third one here. This one is probably already dry, so I'm going to do the other one. Central vein. Overlapping leaf. And now all I'm missing is a little ribbon, which I'm going to make red, I think would be a nice color. I'm going to keep using my 0 size brush and my cadmium red light. And if your blue is very, very dark for your background behind your ribbon, blue plus red equals purple. So don't be surprised if these ribbon sections look a little bit purple to you. It's perfectly fine, because again, these are supportive elements and it'll still look very nice. HB pencil. By this point, everything down here is pretty dry, so I'm not going to be affecting anything. I'm going to be creating 2 straight lines here at the bottom. If you have a ruler, it's going to help you make things straighter. So notice how I created 2 light lines over here at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is write happy at the top and holidays at the bottom. And what I like doing in order to ensure that my letters are going to be a little bit more centered in space, we're going to be doing happy holidays. I'm going to count the letters in each word. So here I have 5 letters. And here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 letters. I divide that number into 2. This I can't really divide into 2 because it's 5 letters. It's an odd number. And so I have to use the P as my center point. But holidays I can divide into 2 because I have 4 and 4. If I have, say, this amount of space for my 2 words on my greeting card, then I have to make sure that that I visualize the central point in both and make sure that this P falls right in the center and make sure that the I and the D fall right on the sides of the center line. Does that make sense? Because this is going to help me keep things centered. Once I have these centered in this space, then all I need to do is add the A and the H on the left and the P and the Y on the right. And then over here, I make my way back. I have an L, I have an O, and I have an H. And then over here, I have an A, a Y, and an S. And this helps me keep things centered. And then aside from this, I will show you what I do in terms of how I first draw my letters in pencil, and then I go ahead and go over them with my drawing pen. I never, ever, ever go right in with a drawing pen because ink is permanent, and I like making sure that I have at least somewhat centered letters and that my letters are the size and the location that I want them to be before going in with my pen. Okay, so that's the first thing that I think of once I have my message or my words that I'm going to be including decided on. That is the first thing that I do. Okay, so I'm going to set this over here to serve as a reminder as I'm drawing my letters. I've already drawn the 2 lines. If you want to make sure that things are centered, I would also try to add at least a couple of light vertical lines, right? Because I don't want to do too many lines, but I do want to explain myself. See how I have 2 rectangles here? I made sure to leave enough space over here, enough space over here, or a relatively same amount of space on the left and the right of those rectangles where I need my message to fit. And I'm gonna do my middle vertical line here. Do this very lightly because you don't want to affect your artwork. You want to be able to erase this later. So that's the center line that I was talking about over here. This one. I'm gonna just place this here so that you can see this. You can use whichever type of lettering you want. If you want to do this in cursive and you're one of those people who has beautiful cursive handwriting, do it. I hate my cursive. I don't like it. I think uppercase letters are easier for me to draw. I trust myself more with uppercase letters. But you can use any type of letter that you want. I'm gonna go in with a micron pen. This is a 0.5 size. And I'm gonna build a little shape around my normal letters. I'm gonna create one and then I'll explain. I just have to focus. Focus. See that? I just created a shape around my pencil work, around my normal letter. I'm gonna do another one. I try to focus. There's an A, and I can decide if I want to fill them in after, okay? I'm gonna do the same thing for all my letters. And just take your time. Let me know if you guys have any last questions because we're about to finish here. And I want to make sure to answer all your questions before I go. Here's happy. H. Whenever I repeat a letter that I've already drawn, I try to look back at my previous H or whatever it is to make sure that I'm creating the same shape. And I also try to keep the same thickness as well. Holidays. I have another A, so I look back at my previous A. Try to keep it similar to that. And I'm missing my S. The S is difficult. I'm going to concentrate. I would just allow my ink to dry and then go ahead and erase your pencil work. I've never had any issues with my 3 favorite pens that I like using for my pen and ink work, which are pigment liners from Staedtler, Unipin fine liners from Mitsubishi Pencil Co., and micron pens. They usually dry, they have ink in them that dries pretty quickly. So I've never had any issues with smudging, and they all work great for line and wash pieces because the ink is permanent and smudge proof. So, but still, you want to wait for at least a minute or 2 before erasing if you're going to be erasing out your pencil work. Sometimes, if I make little mistakes, I like filling in letters. And sometimes I fill in just certain letters and I leave others as they are. I think it adds a little bit of personality and kind of an imperfect look to the piece. Sometimes variety is interesting. So, but you can also fill all of them in if you would rather make all of them like a bold black. It's also something that you can do. I wish you an amazing rest of your day. Thanks so much and talk to you guys very soon.